Seeing how well Arc Raiders plays on the GTX 1050 Ti, I really wanted to test the game on some even older GPUs than either Polaris or Pascal. And no, I'm not talking about the GTX 600 or 700 series. The game looks awful with just 2GB of VRAM, and I have no Kepler card that has more than that. I'm talking about the Radeon family, as Chris P calls it. The Radeon R990X. Using its 290 watts of TDP, it will fiercely argue that it was a first of its kind, so it cannot be a rebrand. In past tests, this card performed at around the same performance as the RX 570. The Radeon R9280, a rebrand of the older Radeon HD 7950. In terms of GPU horsepower, this card is the equivalent of the GTX 1050 Ti. The question here is, if 2GB of VRAM is too little for this game, will the 3GB available on this card be enough? The R9370-1024, and just like the real R9370, a rebrand of the R9270, itself a rebrand of the HD 7870, this AliExpress special also has 4GB of VRAM. But the 1024 shaders count point out that it is actually a rebrand of the R7370, itself a rebrand of the R7265, which, as all of you Radeon historians know, is a rebrand of the HD 7850. But unlike the full-size 1280 shaders R9370 or the cut-down R7370, both clocking at least 925 MHz, the AliExpress variant has a GPU clock of 860 MHz. Now, and this will sound weird, the card can safely overclock back to its official base frequency, so in this video you will get two sets of the results for this one. The test system is the same as for all the other GPUs tested in this game, a Ryzen 5 5600 based PC with 32GB of DDR4 running in dual channel at 3600 MHz. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the computing power and the pixel rate of the R9370 are not quite enough. This is valid for both 860 MHz and 925 MHz GPU clock frequencies, as the average FPS reaches low 20s and does not go higher than 25. The 1% low stays under 20 FPS. Not really playable, not at this resolution. But the Tahiti GPU used by the R9280 has both the computing power and the pixel rate needed, and this is visible in both the average FPS of 43 and the 1% loss of 34 FPS. The game is playable at this resolution and low settings, and the 3GB of VRAM ensure that the visuals steer clear of the potato look that 2GB would deliver. As for the hairdryer posing as a GPU, as I like to call the 290X, it can run the game just fine, with 68 FPS for the average and 57 FPS for the 1% lows. Obviously, 1600 by 900 will make life easier for all GPUs. There is no real reason to run the R9290X at this pixel count though. Don't get me wrong, 83 FPS on average and 66 for the 1% lows is better, but you pay for this performance with the ability to spot and engage enemies at longer range. The R9280 should also run better, but the performance can vary. This is a multiplayer game after all, and there are plenty of variables that will affect the performance. In this case, the 900p run managed a bit less, 39 FPS on average and 30 for the 1% lows. Still playable. The performance of the 925 MHz clocked R9370-1024 barely makes it into playable territory, with an average FPS of 32 and 1% lows of 27. One can only wonder what a 30 FPS frame cap will do. At 860 MHz, the same card averaged 26 FPS with 21 FPS for the 1% lows. One would think that the Pitcairn based card finally reached playable frame rates, but as seen with the R9280, you do need a bit of performance margin. So let's drop the resolution again, this time at 1280 by 720. The R9290X had playable performance even at Full HD, so the 97 FPS on average should come as no surprise. 77 FPS for the 1% lows is also more than enough, and the game plays very well. The R9280 also manages good numbers, 58 FPS for the average and 41 FPS for the 1% lows. But then again, the Tahiti-based card played the game just fine at all three tested resolutions. As for the last acquired Radeon card, the R9370 manages 40 FPS on average and 30 FPS for the 1% lows. And this was with a GPU running at 860 MHz. Clocked at 925 MHz, it performed a bit better, with 38 FPS for the average and 32 FPS for the 1% lows. In both situations, the game stayed playable, even on this card. I was hoping for this kind of results, seeing that the game developers listed Nvidia's GTX 1050 Ti as the minimum specs requirement for a GPU. The R929X is definitely faster than it, and it supports DirectX feature level 12.0, so no surprises here. The R9 was somewhat equivalent in performance to the 1050 Ti, but the main question for this GPU was if the 3GB of VRAM would be enough. Another question I was considering was if the supported DirectX feature level of 11.1 would be fine. Fortunately, the card performed well, so the answer is yes for both questions. The R9 performs slower than the 1050 Ti, but I hope that the card would perform acceptably at 720 resolution. And it did. Its 4GB of VRAM then allowed it to avoid the graphical glitches encountered when using its 2GB siblings. So, there you have it, a late 2025 release title running on a 10 years old mid-range GPU, or even 13 years old if one looks at the first Bitcoin powered card, the HD 7850. But make no mistake about it, it's the 4GB of VRAM that allowed it to still be useful in this game. And this wraps up the series covering Arc Raiders. Not because I don't like the game, but rather because I ran out of hardware that can play it. I hope you enjoyed it.